I guess if something,
If you
I
were
was
what you're
going to
gonna
start with
say.
I was going to start with housekeeping, but that's terrible for the people watching this recording. So people watching the recording, hello, and then some housekeeping, and then so if we say something in this recording that you are worried about, then we don't need to send that recording anywhere, or we can edit it out. So please feel free to get in touch. I guess I will open the session saying thank you very much, MyFest, for having us. Thank you, Rissa, for hosting and putting up with things like a request 10 minutes before the session going, I don't have a link. I was probably supposed to do something. So thank you for hosting us. Thank you for wrangling us as we go on. And thank you to Stephanie for, well, I don't know. I was going to say for agreeing, but actually,
For
I feel like it might have,
absolutely
I think it might have gone
nothing.
the other way around. Did I might have agreed. I don't know. So before we go any further, I just want to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations, who are the traditional custodians of the land from which I am speaking, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Stephanie, do you want to do anything like that?
I have not pulled together maybe Rissa knows.
We live on the unceded lands of the Sandia Pueblo.
Thank you.
And we also honor elders past, present, and emerging.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. We'll edit that bit out. You can
I have my statement somewhere, but I was like, oh no, my brain just.
I should not have done that to you.
Okay.
So I get the history of this, I think, is that Stephanie announced a different workshop and I expressed disappointment in not being able to go to that. And be careful, everybody, because somehow that resulted in me actually having to run a session with Stephanie rather than just being able to attend hers. So just watch what you say. But it's really cool because Stephanie is someone that I've followed for a long time. I think I really value your insights and your knowledge and the methodical way you kind of go through how we think about evidence and your your ethical knowledge, which you should probably plug your book either now or later. Is now a good time or later?
Sure. It's ethics and educational technology. Oh, look at that. Thank you, Danielle.
Nice one, Danielle.
Yeah.
Everyone should read
brilliant,
that.
Vanna. Thank you.
Yeah, I 100%, I'm 100% sure that's an amazing book, even though I haven't read it yet.
The best book ever.
It might be the best book ever, one of the best books ever. But let's not say how long that list is.
Better than Shakespeare. I mean, come on.
It's so much better than some of Shakespeare's work.
Some. Okay. All right. I'll take
published
that.
or unpublished. Anyway, so the idea was that we were going to talk about design and the ethics of design, but in a pragmatic way, because it's easy to think about the ethics of technological integration and design and think, well, that's a problem and that's a problem, and then not be able to go anywhere. So our idea was, let's help people think through what you can actually do to not ignore ethics, but to not become frozen and sort of blind or frozen from the possibilities of bringing technology in. So we decided that we would first of all talk about what we're calling a problematic, which we've defined as a thing that constitutes a problem or difficulty. And then we would go into some stories about how people have those problematics, or that problematic manifests for people and what they've done. Then we'll get you involved to extrapolate, or to talk about some tensions that you faced, and then to extrapolate some hypothetical tensions, and then we'll go into our thoughts about how we move on. So the problematic that we came up with was, how can you be pragmatic and ethical together? How can you pragmatically and ethically navigate entanglements and tensions? I should say that as we go through, please feel free to just interrupt us, put your hand up, or type stuff in the chat, because it's always, in my experience is that there are always people in the audience that are at least as knowledgeable as I am, and it's so good to hear from all of you. So we happen to be the ones that are kind of on the bill, but you're also leading this session. Well done to you. So please, please get involved. Is there anything else we should say, Stephanie, before you launch into some stories?
I don't think so. Mm-mm. All right, thank you, sir. Pardon me. And Danielle, thanks for posting that. It's funny because chapter 6 is my favorite chapter too. I think I may have written that chapter first, and then we kind of built the whole book around it. And I kept wanting to move it to the front, but it really it really flowed, I think, where it's at anyway. So, but it's my favorite chapter too. I love talking about design. And so that's really a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So, oh, good. That's good to hear. So we wanted to start off with some stories that help capture the tension that can arise sometimes around trying to incorporate ethical issues into design. I think sometimes ethics get talked about or debated as very binary, right or wrong, good or bad, or very, very evaluative in that regard. In fact, that's exactly what chapter 6 is all about. And I love Caroline Whitbeck's approach of ethics as design, where she says, you know, that's a really simplistic way to approach ethics. Rather, it's about navigating and figuring out and devising solutions to very complex problems. So I wanted to start with a few stories that I thought would help us get into this. Now, these are all from actual articles. And so I'm going to copy the links here for you and put them over in the chat area. This first one is an article entitled Empowerment and Constraint, Design of a Home Care Worker Training Program. And it's by Amber Gallup at the University of New Mexico and some of her co-authors. And it's just I think it's a brilliant discussion where Amber really gets into a complex design situation. She worked as a contractor for a worker education center out in California. She was really excited to design training for home health care workers. These are workers who typically are immigrants who have come to the US. And so when she first started this project, I think she was really excited about empowering those home health care workers and helping them develop their skills and their careers as a result of the training that she was helping to build. And what she encountered, she went into this with a very clear vision. You know, Amber's a very thoughtful, I know her personally, she's a very thoughtful designer, really good at articulating, okay, here are the values that I'm walking into a design project with. And so that's exactly what she did here. But she quickly encountered some conflicts around the language that they were using on things and differing perspectives around whether or not how things were framed. And especially in California law, the people who employ the healthcare workers have a lot of rights and privileges as employers. And so that started to shape the language of the training, the emphasis, you know, what they were learning, all kinds of things. And so in this particular case, Amber talks about how she navigated just a rather difficult design decision where she felt like her views and values as a designer and her ethical principles conflicted some with some of the context and some of the other stakeholder views. But what I really like is how Amber talks through here, like I said, about how she navigated those tensions in that particular design situation. The next example I want to give you here is, let me get the link here. It's another design case. And I love design cases because they're intended to capture these very sorts of tensions that designers navigate. It's not a simplistic, these are my objectives and here's what I did and here's a technology that I used and, wave of a magic wand and ta-da, here's this perfect thing. Rather, it's a way to talk about here are the decisions that we make as designers and how we balance or, like I said, navigate some of those tensions. So this one, the next one that I put up here is by Catherine Steele and colleagues talking about designing accessible maker spaces. And what I liked about this one as an example is that often we talk about accessibility as a sort of absolute good, right? Like we want to design everything to be accessible. Well, that's actually a pretty complex idea and a complex charge, trying to figure out how to make things accessible. And what this design team ran into were instances where when they tried to make the makerspace accessible for the needs of one subset of the population, they actually ended up making it inaccessible for others in the population. So for example, blind or visually impaired users who they were working with really liked for tables and things like that to be very stationary and stay in place because they develop a mental map of what the room looks like. And so once they know where things are at, it's much easier to navigate. Exactly. That's why UDL is insufficient. But there were others, of course, for whom having flexible mobile tables, chairs, etc., improved accessibility into that environment. Well, now you've got these two seeming goods that are actually in conflict or in tension with each other. And so those are the real problematics, right? That designers and those of us who are in those sorts of roles that we really have to work on and figure out how do we resolve. And there's often no super neat, clean solution for that. And then the third one I'm going to share is very different. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but this is one of my favorite stories that I always have my students read. And it's Look Who's Talking. It's not the movie, but it was written in 1999 by Howard Rheingold, who is a really fascinating sociologist who has studied technology, got really hot on online learning and technologies and stuff. And is a fun guy to talk to about that kind of stuff. But he wrote this fantastic article where he went out and observed one Amish community here in the United States and their adoption of cell phone technology. And what I love is how he captures here again, how it's not this simple idea of a binary accept or reject, especially with the Amish. I think people tend to have an idea of that's a culture community that's very anti-technology. Instead, what he observed is that this is a culture that has a lot of conversations about technology, where they very explicitly and intentionally articulate what are our communal values, what do we want this technology to help us accomplish as a community, and how could we implement it in such a way that it could support us, or even can it be implemented in such a way that it could support our community? And so if they come to a decision that, no, this is actually going to be too disruptive to our community and our communal values, then they will reject the technology. But there's a lot of other technologies that they incorporate into their community. They just don't do it the same way that you might have adopted cell phones, for example, into your own lives. So what they decided to do in this case, for example, was they said, okay, we see value in cell phones, in part because if somebody's out in the field working and they get injured, there could be real value in them having an ability to make a 911 call real quickly and get emergency medical services to them. At the same time, they were really concerned about, mental health, social disruption, other things as well associated with the phone. So they decided to create community boxes around their community where the cell phones would reside there, so they would be available for anybody who needed them, and they would be placed in different situations or places, locations where again, maybe it's near a field, so that if somebody needs to get to that quickly, they can, or something like that. But they would not adopt it on a one-on-one sort of basis to use individually in their homes. It's a really interesting idea or example of humans very actively exerting their agency and their will on a technology to maybe not shape the design of it, but definitely shape the implementation and the use of it, based on their shared value system. And in this article, Reingold uses a great term that I love. He calls them adaptive techno-selective. And I love that. I love the emphasis on adaptation, first of all, that what they're doing is not simply making this binary decision, like I said, of adopt or reject. A lot of times what they're doing is they're figuring out, how would this or how could this fit? And so how are we going to adapt this technology to our culture? And then they devise those sorts of solutions, or they design those solutions. And then techno-selective too, of course, introduces the idea of being selective about the technology. And of course, in this story, or in this particular case, they're using those shared communal values and beliefs to create a framework for how are we actually going to select technologies. And the article talks about different technologies that they adopt too, like grilling technologies and all kinds of things. It's a fantastic story. So we thought we'd start us off with a few stories to get you thinking about some examples where designers are talking about situations or contexts or problematics where it's not a really simple, like I said, yes or no, 0 or 1 sort of decision, but designers are clearly navigating these complex spaces. So Tim, do you want to take the baton at this point, or?
I can do. That was great.
Okay.
Really nicely told stories. So like Stephanie said, what we think is that it's really important to move past binaries of, is this technology good or is this technology bad? And to think about design as a process of navigating tensions and entanglements, and using design as a kind of a tool for navigating these conflicting constraints, the different specifications, the different user needs, and kind of building those parameters into design. But I think we need to flesh this out a little bit more and make it a bit more real for all of us. So what we were hoping was that you, the participants, would volunteer some stories. Tell us a quick story in which there were difficult tensions. So where you are, maybe there were tensions between different ethical considerations, different values, different demands, different stakeholders, different constraints. So just have a think, and please be brave and volunteer to tell us a little bit about a time in which, where you are, there were these conflicting tensions and things. It may have ended well, it might not have ended well, it might be still ongoing. There might have been mistakes made, there might have been failures and vulnerabilities, and there might have been successes. And if you can just kind of talk us through one story where you are. Maybe someone wants to talk about, yes, we do, Rissa. So there should be plenty of stories. So feel free to put your hand up or just jump in and speak. Feel free to post something in the chat, and then we're going to use all of this as raw ingredients a bit later on. Virginia, thank you for bravely going first.
Well, I actually, I had wrote down some notes as Stephanie was telling some stories, and one of the problematics that I had is when I'm teaching online, I have students from various, I live in New York, my university is in New York, but we have such differences in areas in terms of bandwidth, in which we have some areas in which there is absolutely no bandwidth. And, or if there is, it's so expensive that students aren't able to actually use it. So design wise, minimal would be the best. But I was teaching a course in public speaking, and students needed to create a presentation. And so the question was, it had to be a professional presentation, but how do you do that when you have students that don't have access to the technology that they need? So, and basically what I ended up doing was allowing students to pre-record. One thing that we do have in New York State is we have a library system in which there's technology in every single library, regardless of where it is. So in really rural areas where there's no other resources, students all of my students had computers, but they could pre-record. And then if they were having trouble with bandwidth, they could go to their local library and upload it. Previously, they had to, and here, the question about due dates, and you give them extra time, and those who have the technology, I wanted, part of this course was that they had to present to the rest of the class. So if they're pre-recording, is it the same as someone who does it for live? So having to evaluate what the assessment would be, and sort of changing somewhat the assessment, because some people were doing it live and some people had it very polished because they were able to pre-record and edit and things like that.
That's a really great story. Thank you. And how would you say, would you say there's like a conclusion to that story in terms of how it falls out?
So what I did was I felt ethically, if I make it optional for the mode, to give choice in mode that students wanted to present, that it was fair with everyone, because everyone had the same options. It didn't really, for people who were that I wanted them to learn how to present live, it wasn't necessarily the best, but what I did do was then followed up with questions and answers. So during that part, that was sort of the live piece. And I felt like making it available for anyone to have the choice. Everyone had to answer questions. So there were some parts where it was everyone had to do it. And then there are other parts where you could pick or choose depending on what your situation was or your comfort level.
Thank you. So I don't want to go into it too much right now, because we'll get a few stories and we'll kind of come back and make sense of it all. But one of the things I want us to hang on to is the question of whether there is ever a right way to do assessment, and how that might link to things like epistemology and your view of the world and how it works. But let me just park that there. And see if we can have maybe one more story, and then we're going to do a sort of slightly creative exercise. So has anyone got one more story they'd like to share? Danielle.
Yeah, I was in a MOOC recently, and there was a lot of issues. So I'll try to address just a few of the tensions. So one of the tensions was that we were required to post in a few discussion forums each week, and to respond. It's the traditional post once, respond to 2 people. Except that the problem was that none of the posts were threaded. The forum didn't allow for threading. So the tension was this requirement and the impossibility of fulfilling it technically, of having smooth threading. So we discovered that we couldn't do that. And so we found a way, like we would cite someone's name. So responding to blah, blah, and then we would put the information. So you would use your search tool a lot to find other people's information. But given that it was MOOC and it was global, there were a lot of posts. So you would my technique, my way to break the tension was to try to find posts within the first screen, within the first 10 posts that I saw, and post only to them. And then it was easier for me to find information afterwards. And if people looked up my name, well, they could see all my posts closer together. Another tension was, we had a checklist. We had a checklist on form we were using, but the checklist was supposed to automatically check off the things that we're completing. So if you watched a video that was posted on the platform, great, it would get checked off. But if you didn't fully watch the video, like if you left like 10 seconds at the end not unwatched, it was marked as incomplete. So, okay, so I'm discovering this. So, okay, go watch the movie and maybe play it twice the speed, because I've already seen the content. So now I'm reviewing the content. Okay, I'm learning a second time, I guess, but I would play it to the fullest. And another element was that there were these synchronous sessions, and that was hard because I was getting up at 6 a.m. to watch these synchronous webinars 4 times, once each week of the MOOC. And when you would go, well, you go to see on the checklist later, it didn't get marked off. And it was explained to us later that it would only get checked off if you watched the recording. And watching the recording wasn't a requirement. And so I guess the tension breaker there was that somehow they knew, the course runners knew who had attended the webinars. And I got my certificate at the end of the course. But why plan to use technology that doesn't fulfill everything? So I think there were some design issues in the technicalities.
That's a lovely example. And it makes me think maybe, I mean, this is something I go on about a lot, so apologies if you've heard me do that before, but it's very easy to forget the purpose of something and the values that we bring to education because we're focusing on the method and the technological functionality that we've got in front of us, and we're like, oh yeah, I forgot why we started doing this in the first place. So it sounds to me a little bit like the system got in the way of what actually mattered to people. And a couple of things I want to park from your story are the idea that you have agency. So you've got this technological setup and this design, but within that, people have agency as long as they can think of ways of doing things that make sense for everybody, and they have a vehicle or mechanism for negotiating that. And I wrote in the notes this word fudging, which I've been using a lot lately. And what I mean by that is you always have systems and structures that have been set up for a reason, but they never work 100% of the time. They block things off and they actually get in the way. And so the possibility of fudging to me is absolutely essential in making a system work. It has to be possible for somebody on the ground to make a judgment to say, at this point, we need to diverge a little bit from the system that we've created in order to keep people safe or to make something work. An example might be somebody at the airport recently was separated from their child because there was a problem with the child's visa, but not the parents or something. And the parent got through the gates and the child was stuck on the other side of the gates. And the system did not allow those two people to remain together. And you can imagine, even if you're not a parent, you can imagine how horrendous that is in a busy airport. And it maybe takes at least 15 minutes, 20 minutes to get back to your child. And that is unacceptable. So in a case like that, it has to be possible to fudge that system somehow. Somebody needs to be there to go, look, we can't separate those people. We need to find a way around. So in your case, there's probably a bit of fudging. I think there's always fudging, but is the fudging, is it possible to do fudging in a sort of sensible, ethical, appropriate way or not? And that is a great question. Is fudging an exclusively human element? Please type your answer in the chat. I would love to know what people think about that. So I'm wondering, Stephanie, do you think it's still a good idea to do the extrapolation exercise briefly and then come back and we try and turn it all
Well, I
into
wonder, given the, actually, I wonder if we do have another story. It seemed to me that we might have had another story. No?
Do you
Okay.
mean in the chat or in the?
Maybe that's what it was. I think maybe I saw one.
Emily's
somebody in
posted
the
something in the chat.
Yeah, Emily's is the tightest of the stories. Everything else that like I put in or other
Oh,
folks put
yeah,
in are
yeah.
just huge, large, ongoing ethical dilemmas.
Yeah, accessibility is so I used to be a ID at a national center here for low incidence disabilities. So for me, that's always a really easy go-to example to talk about. And I think that's a much more complex design space than we actually talk about. In fact, I think sometimes our discussion right now around accessibility in particular is probably pretty simplistic or limited. I don't think we framed it in some useful ways. In fact, I'm hoping to get a theory paper out on that at some point soon. But I think that's a really good example of times when we're asked to, or maybe we enter into a project, pardon me, with this value or this commitment saying, I want to make it accessible or something like that. But it's running up against other constraints, and that may be resource constraints, it may be knowledge constraints, time constraints as a resource, things like that, where accessibility is a place where I hear a lot of designers talk about they feel like they fall short of some sort of ideal. And really in the world of design, that's okay, because you you never have absolutely perfect solutions. You just have best fits or the best of what you can do. And so I think too, starting to even reframe some of our own thinking around what is it, holding these absolute ideals around, okay, I have to have a perfect solution to X, or I have somehow failed and it is therefore unethical. I think actually design thinking in my mind sort of reframes all of that to say, our job is to try to figure out what are the best solutions that we can come up with, given all of these complex parameters and the tensions that we're navigating between those. So yes, Virginia.
Just one thing, I had sort of added on to what she had said, but in doing these trainings as a student, one of the things that I think it comes up that is not often enough questioned is if the story is appropriate. And I can remember, for example, when we had sexual harassment training, and the story that came up was something that was really, I didn't even think this was going to happen, but it was so close to something that had happened to me. And then the way that it was that it was framed was, well, you as the victim, you need to do this. And, it was, and often I'll see stories where I'm like, well, that's not really appropriate for this audience that is going to be viewing this. And I think a lot of times that's not questioned. It's, we need to get this content out. Okay, but there's different ways that you can present it. And sometimes it can be, if you present the wrong one, it can be traumatic for the audience, and they have no choice but to have to go through and have to go through this training.
Yeah, so Tim, I'm gonna kind of both respond to Virginia and transition into yeah, some of the ingredients here and honestly, please everybody brainstorm with us too. We really want to invite you to think of things that we may not be listing or thinking of. But you know, Virginia, as I hear you talk about that, I think of so in my workshop, which we had to move, I plan to talk about this idea of reflective practice and how essential reflective practice is. And, you know, I was sitting in on a session at a conference a year or two ago, and it was a team who developed simulations. And I forget the exact context for it, but there was a you know, more technical member of the team who actually develops the simulations, and then somebody who does more like acting and coaching aspects. And they were talking about how they developed 3 questions that they would pause and ask themselves at different points throughout the whole process of because they were really worried. Their main focus was, you know, racial justice and equity. So what they did was they said they developed questions of um, are do any of our characters reflect any stereotypes? Are we engaging in any whitewashing? And there was a third question that they asked themselves as well. And so what they did was they intentionally, as designers, would pause at every point, you know, storyboarding process, prototyping process, pre-production, all of that, to just stop and check with themselves and see, you know, am I inadvertently creating as a stereotypical character here, or using something that might cause discrimination. And so as I listen to you talk about that example, I think about this idea of just developing reflective questions that you could ask yourself, or you know, we could ask ourselves as designers just very quickly in the moment, you know, am I could somebody actually experience some stress or trauma, or feel re-traumatized as a result of the example that I'm using or the content that we're covering? And if so, how do I handle that? I have a class, I don't teach it here at UNM, I might at some point, but I taught it while I was at UVA, that was on performance improvement. And I always started the class off with a case study, and it was a video case study on the Air France flight disaster. Now, it's a great case study because it's incredibly well documented. There's lots of great resources. We can draw all kinds of information from it. But there's a solid chance that there might be somebody in the class who has had a rather traumatic flying experience and, you know, and reacts negatively to this and does not really want to work their way through that sort of case studies. So, you know, as a designer, I just step back and think of, and first of all, ask myself that question: could a student actually have an emotional reaction to this? And I don't want them to have that, right? It would not be what we want in the learning environment. And so how can I design around that? And I've kept it, but I have alternatives to that they can select from if they really don't want to. And then I also have other ways that they can engage with the same questions that we're trying to explore. So sometimes creating those variations, design variations, and really thinking about how do I create different options within, you know, a design can help address some of that. So Tim, let me hand this back over to you and talk about some of the entanglements and tensions as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we can see quite clearly from people's stories and responses that things aren't simple, and that there are always entanglements of different expectations, different values, different reasons for doing things, and different aspects of context. You know, the scene in which you're trying to do some kind of design is unique to some extent, and that matters. You know, we need to take these contextual things into account. But one of the things that worries me is that there are also entanglements of different views of the world and how knowledge works, and that sometimes they can seem quite intractable.
That's very true.
So if we go to Emily's example of healthcare and accessibility, something I put in the chat is in my experience, because my previous job was in clinical education and medical education, people are resistant to the idea of accommodations and worrying about accessibility for example, medical students, on the basis that medical students just need to be able to cope. You know, when they're thrown into medical practice, nobody is going to give them an extra half an hour to do something. The ideal of the medical graduate is an able-bodied person, heteronormative, mainstream in all ways. And so on one hand, we have tradition, that is, you know, the traditional idea of the medical graduate. We have medical institutions that are set up in certain ways that don't create much allowance for different ways of doing things and different ways of being, and much space for people to develop alternative practices. And there is some scope for fudging, but it's kind of shut down a bit by regulation. So on the one hand, we have all this structural stuff, but on the other hand, we have this, like, I think, still entrenched epistemological view that knowledge is something that accrues in the brain of an individual, for example, or that there is a right way and a wrong way. There are facts and there are skills, and these are like sort of a positivist mindset about how the evidence on which we base educational activities and actually the things that are being learned. And then on the other hand, you have different epistemological views, and these can be in the same person. You know, I think that a single person can hold multiple epistemological views at different times. Jenna, do you want to, sorry, Janana, is it?
Janana, yes.
Yes.
The one tension that was coming to my mind is straight to the point of epistemological views and how we see the knowledge being created. And it comes from the, my view that it is knowledge is constructed in interactions and very much a social activity. And then the struggle of students in teams-based learning, that sometimes it is for me an ethical dilemma, because if I set up at the university where I teach, if I set up a required activity that is team-based, there is no way that I can replace that with the individual requirement. And I'm really struggling with that, because I would like to recognize learners that are not learning in interactions, because there are learners who are not learning in kind of in the community, and they prefer to do it on their own, and leaving them without an option because of the rigid administrative rules, and sometimes also overlaid with technology. If I'm using a team-based activity that is set up in learning management system as a team activity, it's really impossible to extract somebody or offer alternative. So, as you said, it is our view of knowledge and how we design and what we believe how knowledge is created and constructed informs our design decisions, but also creates this entanglement of epistemology,
Yeah.
learning activity, the administrative requirement that are pretty strict, and technology that is also sometimes not flexible enough.
So in a way, I think
offer
what you've done
options.
is, sorry,
Yeah,
in a way,
go
what
ahead.
you've done is to kind of lay out our problematic in more concrete terms there, I think. And it brings me to something, I won't take too long, Stephanie, I'll bring you back in, promise. But it brings me to something you said that I really liked, which you got from somewhere else, and you can acknowledge that, that ethics is an ongoing process. So it's not something that you tick off when you're designing something good. We've sorted out our ethics, and it's an ongoing thing. You have to keep thinking about it. You have to keep revisiting it, and you have to keep doing it in relation to the entanglements that you can trace. And in order to do that, I think you need to have an understanding of your own agency in this system, and you need to have some imagination in order to allow you to see more possible ways forward. I think imagination is one of the great obstacles or catalysts to educational design and ethics, because it's what allows you to see more possibilities, and that gives you more agency. But you have to understand the agency that you have as relational within a system in order to have a realistic sense of what you can do and what's possible. And these epistemological conflicts or tensions get in the way of imagination. For example, if you think that knowledge is a certain way and learning has to be a certain way, then it shuts down your imagination, it shuts down your ability to see another person's point of view. So maybe the thing to do there is to come back to this idea of ethics as an ongoing process of negotiation. You have to kind of allow yourself to be open to things that you don't already think and understand and know. I'll pass on to Stephanie, because otherwise I'll just keep talking for the rest.
No, that's, well, when we were planning out, Tim and I were talking about this, that I really love how Pauline Shanks-Corin defines ethics. I think a lot of people tend to think ethics are the morals or the beliefs themselves. And Corin is a philosopher who actually teaches at the Naval War College. So talk about a context that's got all kinds of ethical issues. And she defines ethics as a process of questioning and reflecting on one's beliefs, values, etc. And so it's that emphasis on the process, that it's separate from the thing, the morals or beliefs themselves. So how can we engage in that continual process of questioning and reflecting and interrogating our own values, the nature of what we're working on, the technologies themselves, as Tim said, as part of this sort of ongoing process that it doesn't really end. And it was funny to hear you say it that way, Tim, about, it's not something that you say, oh, check it off at the end of the day and I'm done. That's exactly how I used to talk about it too, that, it's not like you get to the end of the day and you're like, oh, let me work on my ethics. And then, yep, okay, I'm done. Took care of that. It's something that's really deeply embedded. And I guess in some ways, Rissa, for me, this is going back to your question about, I love how you put it. I don't think I can keep pace with you on the quantum question here. But first, I think first of all, from a systems perspective, when systems work well, we don't tend to notice them. I think what happens is these tensions arise when we start to notice that those systems aren't actually working well. We may not be able to totally unpack why, or what's the root cause of it not working well quite yet. But my inclination would be that if you've got some sort of a sense of the system isn't working, you're picking up on one of those tensions, however big or however small. That, or, again, back to Tim's point about epistemologies, maybe there are some folks who think the system's working just fine, but as you're getting in trying to do some things, you notice, oh, it's absolutely not set up that way. And we do run into this all the time. Heather and I we kind of had a lot of fun talking about this idea in the book. I think it's in chapter 4, where he developed like a whole thing on tensions, because we were like, this is actually deeply characteristic of the work that we do. As designers in this field, we are often asked to do all kinds of things like design something that's very consistent for the user experience from one class to the next. And, oh, by the way, support a faculty member in designing a class that's unique to them and, reflects that particular class. So how can you do that sort of customization, but also standardization at the same time? And ed tech in and of itself tends to be a framework, right? It tends to be its own epistemology or its own view of the world that is more standardized, that prioritizes efficiency. And if you're coming at it and trying to use ed tech in any way that is different from that sort of worldview, you're necessarily going to experience some tensions with technologies and how they're designed, how they're set up, how they're implemented.
I've just gone on a weird one in the text with Rissa there, because you first asked about our quantum entanglement, the really deep ones. I think they are harder to see, but an interesting question for me is, are they intractable? And then you asked about authenticity, ethics and authenticity. And then I've kind of said that for me, authenticity is an epistemological issue. And I studied memory, autobiographical memory, for my thesis. And then I ended up writing this paper about ecological validity, because ecological validity is very important in memory studies. But people seem to think ecological validity, many people thought that meant not doing it in a lab. And then therefore they were doing it out in the real world. And I was like, well, I don't really get what this real world is. And the lab is also part of the real world, and virtual reality is part of the real world. And we can never escape the real world. I don't think. So ecological validity to me meant accounting for the context in which you're trying to understand something. So if it's in a lab, be totally upfront about the fact that it's in a lab and what does that mean. If it's a field study, be really explicit about what the field study entails and what that might mean. And then you kind of end up thinking, well, there's no study that's properly valid outside of the conditions in which it's held. And so I think I've kind of gone off the rails slightly there, but what I think I'm trying to say is that there isn't a context or a way of understanding that is more authentic than another. Authenticity for me comes from acknowledging the conditions or the parameters of what it is you're trying to understand. Did that make sense?
Absolutely. It made sense to me. Yeah. I'm also watching the clock.
Yeah, I meant it made sense-ish. I mean, I was just gonna write that. I guess you're not a fan of generalization and or transferability then.
I think that generalization is essential, but it needs to be done very cautiously. So not in the sort of sense that most people want generalization. So where do we go from here? Let's just maybe recap. So we talked about tensions. We found some ingredients which we've written down as like, I think we need some sort of framework that go for designing ethically and pragmatically that goes beyond good and bad, broad categories, checklists, and even just principles like accessibility, because we need to see ethics as an ongoing process and embed our ethical considerations as explicit design parameters. So we can't design without ethics being one of the ingredients in our design, and that needs to be a sort of ethics that carries on. I think we need to understand our own agency. We didn't get a lot of time to talk about what that means, but maybe we can do some sort of, I don't know, discussion on social media after, I don't know. But I think that's really important. So I wish we'd had more time to go into that. Imagination, I think, is one of the ingredients, which is also about openness to different ideas and this negotiation of epistemology and values with other people. So actually allowing them to express themselves, etc. And then going back to the stories, as Steph said, the sort of design precedents, how people have gone about this before, and people's stories of how they have tried to navigate tensions are really valuable forms of knowledge. So we should kind of try and fold those in to our design framework. We didn't ever think we would solve this problem in this session, but I think we've had a nice chat.
Yeah.
Have you got anything to add?
Yeah, if you, I think I'll close on this. So I am going to be doing 2 initiatives coming up over the next year or 2. The first one will be, I'm gonna co-edit a special issue of the International Journal of Designs for Learning. Let me type this, or Rissa, could you type that in? It's hard for me to type and talk. This is a journal that publishes design cases, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Elizabeth Bowling started this, and she's really drawing from other design disciplines where designers are sharing design cases with each other as a way to build design knowledge. So it's a very different type of knowledge building, right, from traditional sorts of research. And Elizabeth and others have published pieces on what a design case is and all of that, and we'll link to that. But we're going to do a special issue on ethics in design, where we specifically want folks to submit pieces where they are talking about different projects where they experienced maybe there's an ethical dimension to what you're working on, or you had some sort of conflict or something like that, and write about how did you work to resolve that through design, like what were the design solutions that you developed and how did you approach that. And then I'm also going to be doing that same sort of thing with OTESA. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that organization out of Canada. Yeah, Valerie is just fantastic. So I reached out to her and said, hey, I want to do this thing. I want to do this ethics and design showcase because I love what the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Museum does. It's a design museum here in the US. They have showcases where people bring people in all different disciplines. They've never done one around education. So I have this fantasy of doing like a sabbatical, going and setting up a showcase at the design museum. But like they've brought in folks around like the hospitals and dignity and how do you design dignity into a healthcare system. Or they did one on accessibility and how do you design for accessibility into clothing, devices, furniture, and things like that. And so we want to do kind of the same thing around learning design through OTESA and start inviting more of these stories to try to establish that sort of, yes, I do get a sabbatical. I will stick a fork in it. And have designers share those stories and share the insights so we can start to learn from each other, because lots of designers are navigating these same tensions. But I think if we can start to learn from each other of how we're doing that, we can create a really valuable repository of design knowledge. So anyway, thank you all very much for joining us. I don't know if Rissa, if you want to see us all out here, but it was a pleasure to get to connect with you guys, and absolutely feel free to reach out anytime and connect.
That is awesome. And yeah, I'm going to stop the recording. I can hang out for a little bit if that's helpful. I'm supposed to send you all to the feedback for this session, and I can't remember where that is. So I'll have to send it out to you later. Okay. All right.